The morning sun had barely risen over Metro City when Officer Sarah Bennett began her patrol shift on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday. Her polished badge gleamed against her dark blue uniform as she adjusted her rear-view mirror, catching a glimpse of her stern expression. At 38, Bennett had built a reputation in the department for having the highest arrest record in her precinct, though her methods often raised eyebrows among her colleagues. The convenience store at the corner of Maple and 5th Street was already bustling with its usual morning crowd. Among them was Marcus Thompson, a 17-year-old high school senior known in the neighborhood for his kindness and volunteer work. That morning, like many others, he had stopped by to help Mrs. Wilson, an 82-year-old regular customer who struggled with her weekly grocery shopping. "Let me help you with those bags, Mrs. Wilson," Marcus said warmly, carefully placing her groceries in her rolling cart. The store's security cameras captured his gentle assistance, showing him reaching for items on high shelves and ensuring the elderly woman's comfort. Mrs. Wilson patted his hand affectionately. "You're such a blessing, Marcus. Your mother raised you right." She smiled, her wrinkled face beaming with gratitude. The store owner, Mr. Patel, watched from behind the counter, nodding in approval. Marcus had been helping elderly customers for the past 2 years, never asking for anything in return. Outside, Officer Bennett's patrol car slowed to a crawl as she spotted Marcus exiting the store. Her eyes narrowed, and a slight smirk crossed her face. She had received a vague report about a robbery suspect in the area, a young black male in a red hoodie. Marcus, wearing a burgundy school sweatshirt, became her immediate target. Without warning, Bennett swung her patrol car into the parking lot, lights flashing. She jumped out, hand already on her weapon. "Don't move," she shouted, causing several customers to freeze in their tracks. Marcus, confused and frightened, raised his hand slowly. "Officer, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice trembling but clear. Mrs. Wilson, still standing nearby, clutched her cart in shock. Bennett ignored the elderly woman's presence completely. "Shut up and turn around. You matched the description of a robbery suspect," she barked, roughly grabbing Marcus's arms and cuffing him. The metal bracelets clicked shut around his wrists as nearby shoppers began pulling out their phones to record the incident. "But I didn't do anything," Marcus protested, his voice cracking with fear and disbelief. "Ask Mrs. Wilson. I was just helping her with her groceries." Mrs. Wilson stepped forward, her voice shaking with anger. "Officer, this young man was helping me. He's done nothing wrong." Bennett dismissed the elderly woman with a wave of her hand. "Ma'am, stay back. This is police business." Her voice carried a tone of superiority and disdain. Mr. Patel rushed out of his store, waving his arms. "Officer, there's been a mistake. Marcus is a regular here. We have security footage of everything." But Bennett wasn't interested in explanations. She seemed almost pleased with herself as she roughly guided Marcus toward her patrol car. Unknown to her, Marcus's phone in his pocket was still running the voice memo app he'd been using earlier to record his grandmother's cherry pie recipe. As she pushed him into the back seat, Bennett allowed herself a small, satisfied laugh. The sound was captured perfectly on Marcus's phone, along with her muttered comments that would later send shockwaves through the courtroom. Inside the store, Mr. Patel was already pulling up the security footage while Mrs. Wilson called Marcus's mother, Patricia Thompson. Patricia, a respected paralegal at Harrison and Meyer law firm, felt her heart drop as she listened to Mrs. Wilson's frantic explanation. "Stay calm, Mrs. Wilson," Patricia said, her voice steady despite her rising anger. "I'm calling our attorney right now. Please send me the security footage as soon as you can." As Bennett's patrol car pulled away from the convenience store, she was completely unaware that her actions had been captured from multiple angles: the store's security cameras, bystanders' phones, and most importantly, Marcus's own audio recording. Her moment of perceived triumph would soon transform into the catalyst for her downfall. The morning sun now hung higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty parking spot where Marcus had stood just moments before. Mrs. Wilson wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the patrol car disappear around the corner, while Mr. Patel methodically backed up the security footage that would soon become crucial evidence in a case that would shake the entire police department to its core. The fluorescent lights of the police precinct buzzed overhead as Officer Bennett marched Marcus through the station's hallways. Her boots clicked against the polished floor, echoing through the corridors as other officers looked up from their desks. Marcus walked silently, his head held high despite his trembling hands, while his phone continued recording in his pocket. "Look what I caught this morning," Bennett announced proudly to her colleagues, pushing Marcus toward the booking area. Officer James Rodriguez glanced up from his paperwork, his forehead creasing with concern as he observed the young man's school uniform and bewildered expression. "What's the charge, Bennett?" Rodriguez asked, his tone careful and measured. He had worked with Bennett long enough to recognize her patterns, though he'd always kept his doubts to himself. Bennett's laugh echoed through the room. "Armed robbery suspect." Matched the description perfectly. She gestured toward Marcus with a dismissive wave. "Found him skulking around outside Miller's convenience store." "I was helping an elderly lady with her groceries," Marcus spoke up, his voice steady despite his fear. "There are witnesses, security cameras." "Shut it." Bennett snapped, her face hardening. She turned to her colleagues with a knowing smirk. "They always have excuses, don't they?" In the break room adjacent to booking, Bennett's voice carried clearly as she joked with Officer Thompson, unaware that every word was being captured by Marcus's phone. "Finally caught one that'll stick," she boasted, pouring herself coffee. "These kids think they can get away with anything these days." Meanwhile, across town, Patricia Thompson sat in the office of Civil Rights Attorney James Washington, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Mrs. Wilson and Mr. Patel had already sent over the security footage, which played silently on Washington's computer screen. "This is a clear case of racial profiling," Washington said, his eyes fixed on the footage showing Marcus helping Mrs. Wilson. "But we need more evidence to prove a pattern of behavior." Patricia's phone buzzed with a text from her colleague at the courthouse. "They're processing him now," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "James, my son has never been in trouble a day in his life. He volunteers at the senior center, maintains a 3.8 GPA. Back at the precinct, Bennett was filling out her arrest report, embellishing details with practiced ease. Subject exhibited suspicious behavior, attempted to flee, resisted arrest. She muttered as she typed, each false word adding to her narrative. Officer Rodriguez watched from his desk, his discomfort growing. He had seen this scenario play out before, but something felt different this time. The young man's demeanor, his school uniform, the way Bennett was almost gleeful about the arrest, it all felt wrong. In the holding cell, Marcus sat quietly, remembering his mother's words about staying calm in situations like this. He knew his phone was still recording, capturing every sound, every comment, every laugh that echoed through the precinct halls. "Hey, Bennett," called Officer Miller from across the room. "What about that robbery report? Got any details on the actual suspect?" Bennett hesitated for a split second before responding. "Dispatch said young black male, red hoodie. That's what we got." "Strange," Miller replied, checking his computer. "I don't see any robbery reports from this morning in that area." Bennett's expression flickered briefly before she shrugged it off. "Must be a delay in the system. You know how it gets sometimes." As the morning wore on, the precinct began buzzing with activity. Officers came and went. Paperwork shuffled across desks, and phones rang continuously. Through it all, Bennett's voice could be heard, growing more confident with each retelling of her successful arrest. What she didn't know was that Patricia Thompson had already set wheels in motion. The security footage was being enhanced, witness statements were being collected, and most importantly, Marcus's phone continued to record everything: the casual racism, the fabricated details, the proud laughter. By early afternoon, Attorney Washington had already filed an emergency hearing request. The security footage was clear, the witness statements were strong, and unknown to Bennett, her own words would soon become the most damaging evidence against her. As the sun began to set outside the precinct windows, Bennett prepared to end her shift, satisfied with her day's work. She had no idea that in less than 24 hours, her entire world would be turned upside down in a courtroom where the truth would finally come to light. Patricia Thompson's heels clicked purposefully across the marble floor of Harrison and Meyer law firm, where she had worked as a paralegal for the past 15 years. Her colleague, Attorney James Washington, woke beside her as they entered the firm's main conference room. Spread across the large mahogany table were pieces of evidence they had gathered in the mere hours since Marcus's arrest. "Look at this timestamp," Washington said, pointing to the security footage from Miller's convenience store. The crystal-clear video showed Marcus helping Mrs. Wilson at 8:47 a.m., and here's the dispatch log for the entire morning. He slid another document forward. There wasn't a single robbery reported in that district. Patricia nodded, her hands steady as she organized the growing pile of evidence. Mr. Paddle sent over footage from the past 3 months, she said, pulling up additional videos on her laptop. It shows Marcus helping seniors every Tuesday and Thursday morning before school. He's been doing this as part of his community service project. The door opened, and Mrs. Wilson entered, supported by her daughter. Despite her age, the elderly woman's eyes burned with determination. "I've known Marcus since he was a child," she stated firmly, lowering herself into a chair. "That officer, she wouldn't even look at me when I tried to explain." Washington pressed play on Marcus's phone recording, which had been retrieved when he was finally released on his own recognizance. Bennett's voice filled the room, clear and damning. "These kids think they can get away with anything these days," followed by her distinctive laugh. The recording continues for nearly 2 hours. Patricia explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. She made multiple racist comments, admitted to other officers there was no actual robbery report, and even joked about making the charges stick. In another part of the city, Officer Rodriguez sat in his apartment, wrestling with his conscience. He had witnessed Bennett's behavior for years but had always stayed quiet. Now, staring at his phone with Washington's business card in his hand, he knew he had to make a choice. Back at the law firm, Washington's team had discovered a pattern. "We found 15 similar arrests by Bennett in the past year alone," a young associate reported, spreading out the files. All young black males, all charges eventually dropped, but the damage was already done. Patricia's phone buzzed, a text from Marcus. "Mom, I'm okay. But there was another kid in the holding cell. Said Officer Bennett did the same thing to him last month." Washington nodded grimly. "We're building a solid case. Bennett's body camera footage from yesterday should be the final piece we need." But when they requested the footage, the department claimed it was malfunctioning during the arrest. This only strengthened their case about Bennett's premeditation. Mrs. Wilson's daughter, a social media consultant, had been busy too. "The community is rallying behind Marcus," she reported, showing them her phone. 3 different angles of the arrest have gone viral. People are sharing stories about Bennett's previous encounters. As evening approached, Rodriguez finally made his decision. He dialed Washington's number. "I need to meet with you," he said quietly. "There's more you should know about Officer Bennett." Patricia watched as Washington took the call, hope rising in her chest. They had gathered more evidence in one day than most cases saw in a month. Security footage, audio recordings, witness statements, pattern documentation, and now a potential whistleblower from within the department. "The emergency hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning," Washington announced, ending the call. "Judge Hawthorne is presiding. She has a strong record on civil rights cases." Mrs. Wilson reached across the table and squeezed Patricia's hand. "We'll make this right," she said firmly. "That officer won't be able to hurt any more children." As the team prepared to leave for the day, Patricia received one more text from Marcus. "Mom, remember what you always told me about standing up for what's right? That's what we're doing now, isn't it?" Patricia showed the message to Washington, who smiled for the first time that day. "Your son," he said, "is going to help us change things around here." Outside the law firm's windows, the sun was setting on a day that had started with injustice but would end with hope. Tomorrow, in Judge Hawthorne's courtroom, Officer Sarah Bennett would learn that her badge didn't make her above the law, and that sometimes justice comes from the very people you tried to silence. The courthouse buzzed with tension as Judge Hawthorne's courtroom filled to capacity. Officer Bennett sat at the prosecution table, her uniform pressed and badge gleaming, projecting an air of confidence. She barely glanced at Marcus and his family as they entered with Attorney Washington. "All rise," the bailiff called out as Judge Hawthorne entered, her stern expression surveying the packed courtroom. The morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. "Your Honor," Bennett's department lawyer began, "Officer Bennett had reasonable suspicion based on a reported robbery in the area. The suspect description matched." "Objection, Your Honor." Washington interrupted, rising from his seat. "There was no robbery report filed that morning. We have the complete dispatch logs." Judge Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. "Officer Bennett, please take the stand." Bennett strode to the witness box, swearing her oath with practiced ease. Her voice remained steady as she began her testimony, recounting her version of the morning's events. "I observed the suspect." "The student," Judge Hawthorne corrected firmly. "The student?" Bennett continued, adjusting her collar, exhibiting suspicious behavior outside Miller's convenience store. "Based on my 12 years of experience and training." In the gallery, Mrs. Wilson shook her head in disbelief, clutching her handbag tightly. Mr. Patel, who had closed his store to attend the hearing, scribbled notes furiously. "And your body camera footage from this incident?" Judge Hawthorne inquired. "Unfortunately malfunctioning that morning, Your Honor," Bennett's lawyer quickly interjected. "How convenient," the judge remarked dryly. "Officer Bennett, in your 12 years of service, how many times has your body camera malfunctioned during an arrest?" Bennett shifted in her seat. "I don't recall exactly." Washington stood, holding a folder. "Your Honor, we have documentation of 17 malfunctions in the past year alone, all during arrests of young black males." The courtroom murmured. Bennett's confident facade cracked slightly as she glanced at her lawyer. "Officer Bennett," Washington approached the stand, "could you explain why you ignored Mrs. Wilson's attempts to tell you that Mr. Thompson was helping her with groceries?" "I was focused on securing a potential suspect," Bennett replied, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "A suspect in a robbery that was never reported," Washington pressed. Before Bennett could respond, the courtroom doors opened. Officer Rodriguez slipped in, taking the seat in the back. Bennett's eyes widened slightly at the sight of her colleague. "Your Honor," Washington continued, "I'd like to play an audio recording from Mr. Thompson's phone, captured during his arrest and subsequent detention." Bennett's face paled as her own voice filled the courtroom, her laughter, her comments, her admissions to colleagues. The recording was crystal clear, leaving no room for denial or explanation. Furthermore, Washington added, "Officer Rodriguez has provided a written statement regarding Officer Bennett's history of targeting young black males and fabricating probable cause." Bennett's lawyer jumped up. "Objection. This is hearsay." "Officer Rodriguez is present and prepared to testify, Your Honor," Washington countered. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward. "Officer Bennett, would you care to explain these recordings?" Bennett's composure finally cracked. "Your Honor, in my experience, certain demographics are more likely to..." "Stop." Judge Hawthorne's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Are you actually attempting to justify racial profiling in my courtroom?" The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia Thompson squeezed her son's hand as they watched Bennett's professional demeanor crumble under the weight of her exposed prejudice. "Your Honor," Washington spoke again, "we have evidence of a pattern of similar incidents. Officer Bennett's actions show a clear bias and abuse of authority." Judge Hawthorne studied the documents before her, then looked directly at Bennett. "Officer, in all your years of service, did you ever consider that your badge was meant to protect and serve everyone equally?" Bennett sat silently, her earlier confidence replaced by visible discomfort as the truth of her actions was laid bare in the harsh light of justice. The morning sun had climbed higher now, its rays illuminating the truth that Bennett had tried so hard to hide. In the gallery, Marcus sat tall, surrounded by supporters, watching as the officer who had laughed at his arrest faced the consequences of her actions. The preliminary hearing wasn't over, but already the scales of justice were beginning to tip. The courtroom atmosphere grew even more intense as Washington approached the evidence table, lifting Marcus's phone with latex gloves. "Your Honor, with your permission, we'd like to play the complete audio recording from Mr. Thompson's phone." Judge Hawthorne nodded. "Proceed." The first sounds filled the courtroom, the gentle conversation between Marcus and Mrs. Wilson at the store, his polite offers to help, her grateful responses. Then came Bennett's harsh voice, the false accusations, and most damningly, her conversation at the precinct. Bennett shifted uncomfortably in her seat as her own voice echoed through the speakers. "Got another one. These kids need to learn their place." Followed by mocking laughter. Her face reddened as several jurors visibly recoiled at her words. Mr. Patel was the next witness called. He walked to the stand, straightening his tie nervously but speaking with clear conviction. Marcus comes to my store every Tuesday and Thursday morning. For 2 years, he has helped elderly customers with their shopping. I have all the footage. Washington played the security videos on the courtroom screens. Crystal clear footage showed Marcus's regular visits, his consistent helpfulness, and most importantly, the morning of his arrest. The timestamp clearly showed no suspicious behavior, only a young man helping an elderly woman with her groceries. And Officer Bennett? Washington asked. Did she ask to see this footage? No, sir, Mr. Patel replied firmly. She refused to look at it. She wouldn't even come into the store when I called out to her. Mrs. Wilson took the stand next, her voice trembling with anger rather than age. I tried to tell that officer that Marcus was helping me. She acted like I was invisible, like my words meant nothing. Officer Rodriguez's testimony followed, his voice steady despite the obvious discomfort of testifying against a fellow officer. Bennett had a pattern. She would target young black males, especially in that neighborhood. She would laugh about it in the break room, brag about her arrest numbers. As Rodriguez spoke, Bennett's lawyer frantically scribbled notes, but the damage was already done. The evidence was overwhelming, and Bennett's earlier confidence had completely evaporated. Your Honor, Washington continued, we have also obtained records of Officer Bennett's arrest history. He distributed documents to the court. In the past year alone, 92% of her discretionary arrests involved young black males. Of those arrests, 85% were eventually dismissed for lack of probable cause. Judge Hawthorne studied the statistics, her expression growing darker. Officer Bennett, she said, looking directly at the police officer, would you care to explain these numbers? Bennett cleared her throat. Your Honor, I was simply responding to suspicious activity in high-crime areas. High-crime areas? Washington interrupted, presenting another document. The neighborhood where Mr. Thompson was arrested has one of the lowest crime rates in the city. The only spike in arrests comes from your shifts, Officer Bennett. The evidence continued to mount. Community members testified about similar encounters with Bennett. Former arrestees described identical patterns of behavior. With each testimony, Bennett seemed to shrink further into her chair. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. A young rookie officer, inspired by Rodriguez's courage, had come forward with cell phone footage from the precinct break room. The video showed Bennett bragging about her arrests, making racially charged jokes, and admitting to targeting specific neighborhoods. Your Honor, Washington said, standing at his full height, the pattern is clear. Officer Bennett has systematically abused her authority, violated civil rights, and engaged in racial profiling. Her actions have traumatized innocent citizens and undermined public trust in law enforcement. Marcus sat with his mother, watching as the truth unfolded. The same officer who had laughed while arresting him now looked small and defeated, her badge no longer gleaming quite so brightly. Judge Hawthorne's voice cut through the tension. Officer Bennett, in my 20 years on the bench, I have seen many cases of police misconduct. But the level of documented evidence here, the clear pattern of bias, and most disturbing, your apparent pleasure in abusing your authority. She paused, letting her words sink in. This court cannot and will not ignore such a flagrant violation of civil rights. The sun had shifted in the courtroom windows, but no one moved. They all knew they were witnessing a moment of justice that would reshape their community. Bennett's day of reckoning had finally arrived, and her laughter had been replaced by the sound of justice in motion. Judge Hawthorne's courtroom had fallen into complete silence as the technical expert from the police department's Internal Affairs Division took the stand. He carried a laptop containing the recovered footage from the precinct's security cameras, footage that Bennett didn't know existed. Please explain what we're about to see, Judge Hawthorne instructed, her voice carrying through the hushed courtroom. The expert adjusted his glasses. These are recordings from the precinct's internal security system, taken the morning of Marcus Thompson's arrest. The system automatically backs up to a secure server every hour. As the footage began playing on the courtroom screens, Bennett's face turned ashen. There she was, leading Marcus through the precinct hallway, but the angle showed something her earlier testimony had denied. Marcus walking calmly, following all instructions, showing no resistance. Stop the video there, Washington requested. Officer Bennett, you testified earlier that Mr. Thompson was combative and resistant. Could you explain this discrepancy? Bennett's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Her lawyer leaned over to whisper something, but she barely seemed to hear him. The footage continued. The audio was clear enough to capture every word of Bennett's conversations with her colleagues. Her laughter echoed through the courtroom speakers as she bragged about the arrest, made racial comments, and admitted there had been no robbery report. Your Honor, the technical expert continued, we also recovered deleted text messages from Officer Bennett's department-issued phone. He pulled up another screen. These messages show a pattern of coordination with certain officers to target specific neighborhoods and demographics. Patricia Thompson watched as her son's wrongful arrest unfolded from yet another angle. The evidence was overwhelming, but what struck everyone in the courtroom was Bennett's obvious enjoyment of the situation, her smiles, her laughter, her casual cruelty. Officer Rodriguez, still seated in the gallery, shook his head slowly. He had seen this behavior before, but watching it played back in the formal setting of the courtroom made it even more disturbing. Furthermore, the expert continued, we found that Officer Bennett's body camera didn't malfunction that morning. It was manually disabled approximately 2 minutes before Mr. Thompson's arrest. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Hawthorne's gaze sharpened. Manually disabled? Yes, Your Honor. The system logs show it was intentionally turned off and then reported as malfunctioning after the fact. Bennett's lawyer stood up, desperately trying to salvage the situation. Your Honor, perhaps we could take a brief recess to review this new evidence. But Judge Hawthorne wasn't finished. Officer Bennett approached the bench. Bennett rose on shaky legs, her earlier arrogance completely gone. As she stood before the judge, the courtroom screen still showed her laughing face from the precinct footage, a stark contrast to her current demeanor. Officer Bennett. Judge Hawthorne's voice was measured but stern. In all my years on the bench, I have seen many troubling cases, but rarely have I seen such a clear display of prejudice, abuse of power, and, most disturbingly, enjoyment of that abuse. The judge lifted another document. I have here a report showing that your precinct received implicit bias training just 3 months ago. You signed an acknowledgement of completion. Yet here you are, not only displaying that bias but celebrating it. Mrs. Wilson, still seated in the gallery, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Mr. Patel reached over to pat her shoulder consolingly. They'd all watched as Bennett stood before the judge, her uniform no longer carrying the authority it had just hours ago. Your Honor, Bennett finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I can explain. I believe you've explained enough. Judge Hawthorne interrupted, gesturing to the screen still showing the precinct footage. Your actions, your words, and most importantly, your laughter have made your position quite clear. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtroom floor as justice prepared to take its course. Marcus sat straight-backed beside his mother, watching the officer who had humiliated him now facing her own moment of reckoning. Judge Hawthorne shuffled her papers, preparing to deliver her decision. The courtroom held its collective breath, knowing that whatever came next would send ripples through the entire police department and beyond. Bennett's day of laughing at injustice was about to come to an end. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters as Attorney Washington presented the statistical evidence his team had gathered over the past 48 hours. Behind him stood Marcus, his mother, and a group of previous victims of Officer Bennett's discriminatory practices. The numbers tell a disturbing story, Washington announced, holding up a thick report. Over the past 3 years, Officer Bennett has arrested 238 young black males. Of these arrests, 204 were dismissed due to lack of probable cause. But what's more troubling is what we found in the department's own data. Inside the courtroom, Judge Hawthorne reviewed the comprehensive analysis. Charts and graphs showed a clear pattern. Bennett's arrest rates skyrocketed on the first of every month, coinciding with the department's performance reviews. Your Honor, the police department's data analyst testified, Officer Bennett's arrest patterns show statistically impossible disparities. In areas with diverse populations, her discretionary arrests targeted black males 97% of the time. The evidence continued to mount. Former arrestees came forward, their stories eerily similar to Marcus's experience. Each described Bennett's distinctive laugh, her dismissal of witnesses, her fabricated probable cause. We've also discovered concerning financial patterns, Washington continued, presenting bank records. Officer Bennett received performance bonuses based on her arrest numbers. She was literally profiting from these discriminatory arrests. Bennett's lawyer slumped in his chair as more documents were entered into evidence. Text messages between Bennett and other officers revealed casual discussions about targeting specific neighborhoods and demographics. Email threads showed her bragging about her arrest quotas and joking about her methods. Officer Rodriguez returned to the stand, now with additional documentation. After my initial testimony, other officers came forward. They provided these internal messages showing Officer Bennett coaching newer officers on how to circumvent probable cause requirements. The police chief, summoned by the court, sat uncomfortably as he reviewed the evidence. His department's oversight failures were becoming increasingly apparent. "Chief," Judge Hawthorne addressed him directly, "how did these patterns go unnoticed for so long?" "Your Honor," he began, tugging at his collar, "we're implementing new oversight procedures." "That doesn't answer my question," the judge interrupted sharply. Patricia Thompson watched from her seat, her paralegal training allowing her to understand the full implications of each new piece of evidence. The case had grown beyond her son's wrongful arrest into an exposure of systemic issues. The courtroom screens displayed a map of the city, with red dots indicating Bennett's arrests over the past 3 years. The pattern was undeniable, concentrated entirely in predominantly black neighborhoods, even when crime rates were higher in other areas. Furthermore, Washington continued, "We've uncovered evidence that Officer Bennett actively avoided responding to calls in other neighborhoods, specifically to maintain her demographic arrest patterns." A young officer, recently graduated from the academy, provided testimony about Bennett's training sessions. Unofficial meetings where she taught new officers how to target specific individuals while avoiding departmental scrutiny. The police department's internal affairs investigator presented his findings next. "We discovered that multiple complaints were filed against Officer Bennett over the years, but they were systematically buried or dismissed without proper investigation." As the afternoon wore on, the evidence painted a picture not just of individual bias, but of a system that had allowed it to flourish. Bennett sat at the defense table, no longer smirking, as her years of discriminatory practices were laid bare. Judge Hawthorne reviewed bodicam footage from other officers who had worked with Bennett, showing multiple instances of her laughing about arrests, making racial comments, and bragging about her tactics. "The pattern is clear," Washington concluded. "Officer Bennett didn't just engage in racial profiling. She turned it into a career advancement strategy, celebrated it with colleagues, and trained others to follow her example." Outside the courthouse, community activists gathered with signs demanding justice. Local news crews interviewed former arrestees who had come forward with their stories. The impact of Bennett's actions had rippled through the entire community. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the courtroom windows, Judge Hawthorne prepared to address the mounting evidence. The case had evolved from a single wrongful arrest into an exposure of deep-rooted problems within the police department. Bennett's laugh, once a symbol of impunity, had become the catalyst for change. Judge Hawthorne's chambers were silent as she prepared her final ruling. The evidence presented over the past days had transformed a single case of wrongful arrest into a landmark decision that would reshape the department's future. Standing before the packed courtroom, Judge Hawthorne's voice carried authority and purpose. "After reviewing all evidence presented, this court finds overwhelming proof of systematic civil rights violations perpetrated by Officer Sarah Bennett." Bennett sat rigid in her chair, her badge now removed from her uniform, as the judge continued. "The actions of Officer Bennett represent not just individual bias, but a calculated abuse of power that targeted and traumatized innocent citizens. This court orders the following." The judge lifted her written decision. "First, all charges against Marcus Thompson are dismissed with prejudice. His record will be immediately expunged." Patricia squeezed her son's hand as tears of relief rolled down her cheeks. "Second, Officer Sarah Bennett is hereby terminated from the police force, effective immediately. She is permanently barred from serving in any law enforcement capacity within this state." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Bennett's head dropped. "Third, a full Department of Justice civil rights investigation will be launched into the department's practices, oversight failures, and handling of complaints against Officer Bennett." The police chief shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Judge Hawthorne continued. Fourth, the court orders the immediate review of all arrests made by Officer Bennett over the past 3 years. All individuals wrongfully arrested will be eligible for compensation from a fund to be established by the city. Washington nodded in satisfaction as he made notes. Finally, the judge paused, making eye contact with Bennett. This court is referring this case to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution on multiple counts of civil rights violations, false imprisonment, and misconduct under color of authority. 2 court officers approached Bennett, who finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of her downfall. Her familiar laugh was nowhere to be heard as they led her away to process her arrest. Outside the courthouse, Marcus faced a crowd of reporters with dignity beyond his years. "This isn't just about me," he said clearly. "It's about every person who was wrongly targeted, every witness who was ignored, and every laugh that made us feel powerless." Patricia stepped forward to speak as well. "Today, justice wasn't just served, it was transformed. This ruling shows that no badge can shield corruption and no position of power is above the law." Mr. Patel and Mrs. Wilson stood nearby, their presence a testament to the community's role in exposing the truth. Officer Rodriguez, now assigned to help review Bennett's past cases, nodded respectfully as he passed them. The police chief held a press conference announcing immediate reforms: mandatory body camera reviews, enhanced oversight procedures, and a new community review board. The changes came too late for Bennett's victims, but marked a starting point for departmental transformation. Later that evening, Marcus returned to Miller's convenience store with his mother. Mr. Patel greeted them with tears in his eyes and hugs. The security cameras that had helped prove his innocence still watched silently overhead. "Will you still help us seniors with our groceries?" Mrs. Wilson asked, having waited at the store to see him. Marcus smiled warmly. "Every Tuesday and Thursday, just like always. We can't let fear change who we are or stop us from helping others." As they walked home in the fading light, Patricia noticed her son standing taller, stronger. The trauma of his arrest would take time to heal, but justice had given him something powerful: validation that his truth mattered. The story made national headlines. "Officer's laugh leads to landmark police reform." Bennett's case became a teaching example in police academies across the country, demonstrating how bias, arrogance, and abuse of power could no longer hide behind a badge. In the years that followed, Marcus went on to law school, inspired by his experience to fight for justice. The convenience store became a symbol of community solidarity, and Mrs. Wilson proudly shared the story with anyone who would listen. And somewhere in a state prison, former officer Sarah Bennett had plenty of time to reflect on how her laugh of prejudice had transformed into a catalyst for change, proving that justice, though sometimes delayed, would not be denied. The case was closed, but its impact resonated far beyond the courthouse walls, reminding everyone that in the face of injustice, truth and community could prevail, one story at a time.